There have been many important moments in sports that have changed the course of history, many sporting events that have transcended beyond the sport itself and has had a lasting impact on the world as we know it, where race relations such as Jack Johnson becoming the first black heavyweight champion in 1908, or Jesse Owens winning 4 gold medals in the 1936 Berlin Games, or Muhammad Ali returning to boxing after being stripped of his title for not participating in the Vietnam War. Politics and sports have often collided on the world stage. The event that I want to look at is the fight between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling.
No, it is all over. Joe Louis knocked him out in the 11th round. I don't know what to tell you. That last punch was everything. Everything that Louis could throw. Restless and violent was his attack. Mad and savage. And he really was mad, and that's what you just
Joe Louis vs. Max Schmeling is one of the most significant fights in the history of boxing, but to understand why this fight is so important, we need to take a look at who's fighting. Joe Louis, ever known as the Brown Bomber, is one of the greatest boxers of all time who finished his Hall of Fame career with a record of 66 wins and 3 losses, holding many records in boxing, such as becoming the longest reigning heavyweight champion over the span of 11 years and 25 consecutive title defenses. But before Joe Louis will become arguably the greatest heavyweight of all time, we need to go back to where it all began. Born on May 13, 1914 in Chambers County, Alabama, just 2 months before the start of World War I, to the parents of who were the children of slaves shaken by the Ku Klux Klan in 1926, Louis's family moved to Detroit, Michigan, where he would start his amateur career at just the age of 17 and finish with a record of 50 wins and 4 losses. Joe Louis would start his pro career with a record of 24-0, being ranked as the #1 contender for the heavyweight title, considered almost unbeatable. Louis would have to face former heavyweight champion Max Schmeling in what would be one of the most important sporting events in history and what would embody political and social conflict at that time. Leading up to their fight in 1936, one of the most hated men in the world at that time was none other than Adolf Hitler. The leader of the Nazi Party was hated by many different countries due to white supremacy and the unfair treatment of Jewish people, the biggest being the United States of America. And Hitler's favorite boxer was none other than Max Schmeling himself, born in Germany in 1905. This fight was bigger than boxing, as both Louis and Schmeling had the weight of their entire nations and race on their shoulders. This fight was bigger than Louis versus Schmeling, as it represented freedom versus fascism. America desperately wanted to stick it to Hitler and the Nazi Party for their cruel ideology. To put it more simple, this fight was a battle of good versus evil. It didn't make it any better that Joe Louis was black and Schmeling was white, at a point where racial segregation was at its highest. Louis versus Schmeling would take place on June 19th, 1936 at the famous Yankee Stadium in New York City, scheduled for 15 rounds with more than 70,000 in attendance and 57 million in listening on their radios. Leading up to the fight, Schmeling said before the fight that he had found the key to beating Louis, and Schmeling would be right, as he knocked down Joe Louis in the 4th round for the first time in his career. Schmeling continued to dominate this fight, as in the 12th round he would knock out Joe Louis and win the fight. As you could probably guess, America didn't take this loss very well, as many Americans didn't like the fact that a supporter of Nazi Germany not only beat but knocked down the man that was representing America as a whole. This fight was much more than just Max Schmeling beating Joe Louis, but Nazi Germany beating America. This fight sent shockwaves throughout the nation, as grown men and women began to cry when they heard the news that Joe Louis had lost, while Schmeling on the other hand was congratulated for his victory throughout Nazi Germany, as Hitler himself contacted his wife congratulating congratulating him on his win over Lewis. After his loss versus Smelling, Lewis would go on to win the heavyweight title, but after the fight, he would say, "I ain't no champion until I beat Smelling." The rematch was set on June 22nd, 1938 in a sold-out Yankee Stadium for the heavyweight championship of the world. Joe Louis wanted to beat Smelling not only for his personal reasons, but also because the entire United States depended on him too, as Nazi Germany began to ramp up their racial charged propaganda, even though Smelling himself denounced himself as a supporter of the Nazi Party. Going into the first round of their rematch, Louis planned to get the fight over as soon as possible, as he knocked down Smelling early in the first round, then connected with 3 clean shots to Smelling's jaw, knocking him down for a second time, and then a third, when Max Schmeling's corner threw in the towel, declaring Joe Louis the winner and still heavyweight champion of the world, only 2 minutes and 4 seconds into the first round of their rematch. To put that into perspective how dominant this fight was, Joe Louis threw 41 punches, landing 31 of them, while Smelling was only able to throw 2. Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling were 2 of the most impactful fights in the history of sports, as they both transcended outside of the boxing ring, as the fights had political and racial undertones, as the African American race pinned its hopes on the outcome of Lewis's fights as a way to show 1940s America that black people could just be as good as white people. I think what makes this fight so much more interesting is that both Louis and Smelling were pressured into standing up for nations that didn't stand up for them, as Smelling was made public enemy number 1 by Americans, even though he had no involvement with the Nazi Party at all, while Joe Louis was fighting for the honor of a country that didn't even see him as equal and treat his people as such. In the end, Joe Louis would go on to become one of the greatest heavyweight champions of all time, while Max Schmeling would also go down as one of the best fighters to ever live. Even though Lewis's win over Smelling didn't end racial segregation, it did help pave the way for future generations of civil rights activists.